The state and its repressive and oppressive institutions have found a lot of different ways that just have worked in terms of stopping movements, preventing them from rising up. Anytime there are activists who seem to be having some kind of draw, they seem to be getting attention, they seem to be actually having some kind of success, the first tool that's used is essentially isolation. Oh, these crazy Negroes, you don't want to be connected with them. And of course, media propaganda, which is a constant onslaught of ideas, is the number one way that they do this. Stories are put out. Well, first of all, no stories are put out. That's the first way to isolate. Just don't cover it. Just don't talk about it. Pretend like these people don't exist. Highlight other people who do exist who you find more palatable. One of the most effective propaganda strategies is simply distraction. When something is happening, you point somewhere else. You say, oh, but check this out. But what about this celebrity story? Oh, look at this thing that's happening. You find things that people are going to care about, empathize with, things that are going to rub people the wrong way, and you get them emotionally invested in these storylines so that they don't turn their attention towards the fundamental contradictions that exist in society. If you look at social media, there are topics that will, anytime something big is happening politically, you're going to see an uptick of these very viral, trendy, polarizing conversations that start to happen publicly that are really just us digging into people's lives who we don't know and assuming that we know all the details, or just arguing with each other about like this person is right and that person is right, or just relishing the fact of like, ooh, look what happened to them. Finally, they're taken down. I didn't like that guy anyway. And so a large amount of time is spent on distracting tactics. You just don't show the story. But once something becomes too big for them to ignore, or there are things that happen where it's like the public can see it very clearly, then they start to malign the organization. They start looking for ways to isolate the organization. And it's not just on an institutional level. They start to look for ways to isolate people within organizations from each other. And so isolation, the old school divide and conquer, is really the primary tactic that's used. This mythos of the boogeyman, foreign outsiders, invaders. They are the ones who are behind everything. Russia is behind it. China is behind it. Outer-towners are behind it. Like, this is a narrative that's been used since before the Civil Rights Movement, during the Civil Rights Movement, and beyond. There is a foreign threat that is looming, that is lurking underneath the surface, sleeper cells everywhere. And when something happens, no, it can't be that people are just fed up with what's happening in the world. There must be some other force that is crafty enough to use inception to get people to think things without realizing they're being like dragged along, without realizing that they're puppets. So this narrative that students don't know what they're protesting for. They're just caught up in the moment and they're out there and they have no idea why they're out there. Meanwhile, they are saying over and over exactly why they're out there, what their goals are. But you see the media promoting it as, oh, are these even students? And the students who are there, do they even know what's going on? And then faculty jumps in. Well, the faculty is being influenced by the students. And you see this same storyline played out over and over again, this idea of foreign invaders. It's absolute nonsense. People who are immersed in an oppressive experience are hyper aware of oppression. They will inevitably get to the point where it's going to boil over. And they're going to be, I'm tired of dealing with the constant suppression of my humanity. Nature is going to assert itself, and we are by nature human, fully human. And so we're going to continue to assert ourselves, even if we have some lulls in activity. We never have a stop in activity, but even if we have some lulls in activity, it's going to boil over again. We have an insatiable appetite for being what nature has called us to be. On a smaller scale, or should I say a more behind-the-scenes scale, propaganda is used in a different way to cause rifts within organizations, or to malign certain people, to break the trust of certain people. So you hear rumors start spreading about, oh, this person is a grifter. And there are a lot of grifters, right? There are grifters out there. And so people have kind of become accustomed to believing what they hear. And so you'll hear people isolate and be like, well, this person is a grifter. And this person is, or snitch jacketing. This is an old tool that was used where within an organization, they would spread the rumor that this person is a snitch. They're talking to the feds. Meanwhile, the people who are actually talking to the feds, we don't really get to know their stories until after the fact. Which brings me to the next idea of like the strategies and tactics that are used to repress us, to oppress us, to keep us down, and that's sabotage. Sabotage works in a couple ways. There's external sabotage, which goes back to, spreading rumors and things like that. The Black Panther Party in Chicago, Fred Hampton, under the leadership of Fred Hampton, they were very much involved with building a coalition among not just other communities and other organizations, but also among street organizations. And so at one point, the FBI actually put out fake flyers that were supposedly from the Black Panther Party, basically like taking aim at street organizations in order to cause rifts, and to get the street organizations to look at the Black Panther Party as enemies. So that's externally. But internally, there's a way that infiltration works. Sometimes it's informants. Sometimes they catch people on charges and then they flip them and turn them into an informant. Sometimes it's actual police officers who are hired. You can look at the case of William O'Neill, who was an informant working with the cops, feeding information to the cops, and as I understand it, was involved in making sure that the assassination of Fred Hampton was successful. You can look at Eugene Roberts. Gene Roberts was an actual cop who worked for the Bossy unit in New York, which is a special unit, and who was, part of the security team of Malcolm X. In fact, Malcolm X's last breath was taken as Eugene Roberts stood over him and attempted to resuscitate him. And so the head of security for Malcolm X was a cop, and it was so many people who had infiltrated that the cops didn't even all know each other. Different agencies, different departments, they didn't even know how many people were cops in the room. And so infiltration is one for intelligence. It's also for sabotage, to cause rifts, and it's also to contribute to the neutralizing of organizations that they just can't seem to sabotage enough. And that's where we get to assassination. Take out the threat. Eliminate the threat. And this goes to the heart of colonization. Colonization operates on the myth that you can take human beings and use violence to permanently render them inhuman, to get them to accept permanently inhumane treatment, to get them to be fractions of themselves, which is why you come up with things like the 3/5 compromise. And so colonization operates under this mythos that you can permanently suppress people, and the only way that that could possibly work is through relentless violence, constant violence. Not just the isolated incidences that you see in videos, but it is a day-to-day constant thing. And assassination, as well as things like whether it be political assassination or just things like police murder, these are extensions of the day-to-day violence that is enacted on our communities. And when a community engages in acts of self-defense, in acts of resistance, when a community begins to organize for autonomy, for liberation, you of course are going to see an uptick in violence, because violence is the language of colonization. Another tactic that is used traditionally to suppress resistance movements is absorption. We've seen this very recently in 2020, where Black Lives Matter is written on city streets. They took something that was a mantra, a rallying cry, and we're going to leave out all of the stuff that has to do with the organization Black Lives Matter, because in truth, that organization is but a small part of the larger movement that gathered around the call that our lives matter, and we should step up and speak out and resist, state violence. And so in order to kind of make it more benign, you saw corporations putting on the side of stadiums Black Lives Matter. And then you saw a very concerted effort to uplift people who were more corruptible, people who were more interested in upward mobility, and to downplay and kind of like keep in the shadows the people who were just about that organizing grind, people who were more about the actual grassroots organizing, who are still organizing today, some of them still under the name Black Lives Matter. So there is more than one entity that is operating under the name Black Lives Matter. And I'm specifically talking about those who operated with integrity and those who really were using Black Lives Matter as a rallying cry to go at the system on the issue of systemic police abuse, systemic police brutality, and murder. Movement absorption, also we see evidence of that. In after the Black Power movement was violently attacked and ultimately crushed through COINTELPRO, we saw a lot of absorption of movement into academia. And so a lot of people became professors, a lot of people became connected to universities, to schools, and it really has had quite an effect on our movements because our movements were kind of like academic adjacent. Back in the 50s and 60s, you had people who were college educated. You had like the Freedom Riders who would come down from colleges. You had a lot of the leaders were college educated, but the movements themselves were largely comprised of street folk, largely comprised of people who may or may not have had a college education, but who were really immersed in the marginalized communities that were being organized. And what we saw is throughout the 70s, 80s is like, there was a lot more raising up of academic discourse, which really seemed to coincide with a lowering of actual, like, just old school, tried and true community organizing. And so movement absorption is a very effective tactic where they take something and they try to suck the power out of it. And so you see the development of these tactics over time, but they are still fundamentally the same ideas. And that's the thing about colonizers. They're not very inventive people. They create new technologies, but they tend to use the same tactics over and over again. For instance, fear-mongering. During the Black Power movement and even before that, and when you look at the labor movement, it was really about the Red Scare and like everyone's a communist and like communism is going to be the end of your freedom, and that still is done to today. But an interesting thing is happening now that kind of shifts the nature of what they're able to do. One, they have to put more and more outrageous claims out there. So you have the myth about beheaded babies that comes out, right after, the actions of Hamas on October 7th, which have been clearly debunked. And you have these horrific stories that continue to be parroted because they realize that we are in a time where we see through the bullshit. Right? And so the way I like to compare it is like, so if you've ever fasted before, or you've ever been in a situation where you had to go days without eating, after a short period of time, you get to a point where you are dreaming about food. And if you've ever done like a dry fast where you don't drink any water at all and no food or water, the thirst consumes you. Your thoughts get consumed by food, by water. When you go to sleep, you dream about it. You dream that you're eating your favorite foods. You're sitting there and just like the clock seems to be getting slower and slower because you're becoming more and more fixated on your hunger. And that's what we see in this society as it becomes more and more marginalized, and the gap between the rich and the poor gets bigger and bigger and bigger. The contradictions get raised more and more and more. And people are no longer able to distract themselves by, like, if I'm fasting, I'll be like, well, let me just get a little project done, or let me, veg out on Netflix to get through this day. No, that no longer works anymore. When the conditions in society are getting so dire, so drastic, when you got to go, like shell out half your paycheck just for groceries, when the rent is too damn high, when you're constantly being bombarded with the fact that you don't have the resources that you need in order to survive, and you're also being bombarded with the reality that corporations are making record profits at your expense. The rich are getting exponentially richer even in the worst of conditions, even in a pandemic, they have record-breaking profits in a pandemic. And so when you're being bombarded with that reality, that some people are living this dream and you are living this nightmare, then it gets to the point where the hunger becomes, it consumes you. You can't get beyond it. You can't ignore it anymore. And so you end up getting to a point where you have to confront reality. And so in response to that, the old school tactics of, psychological warfare, the old school tactics of propaganda and manipulation stop working as well. Because there's nothing louder than a growling stomach. And so when fear-mongering breaks down, they have to branch out into a new tactic, and that is the literal assault on the truth itself. We enter the era of alternative facts, and you can believe whatever you want to believe. I present you my truth, you present me your truth. Oh, well, we just have different truths. No, truth is truth. You can have different supporting facts than I do, but ultimately, some supporting facts are going to offer more legitimacy, more context, more nuance than other supporting facts. But what we are dealing with now is the age of the outright lie. And that's connected to fear-mongering because you have to get outrageous these days. Propaganda is absurd these days. And you hear the stories that they're saying, and you hear people talking, and you're like, how can we even have a debate? How can we even have a public discussion? These people are liars. I mean, like, not just liars, like they are imaginatively lying. They're not very creative with their repression and their oppression, but they got some skills in terms of like being duplicitous and coming up with outrageous lies to stoke the flames. The old school tactics of isolation, these aggressive propaganda campaigns, sabotage both from within and outside of organizations, assassination, and along with isolation, that includes incarceration as well. I didn't mention that before. All of these tactics are still very much alive and being used. A lot of this you may already be aware of, but I thought it was important to kind of like at least provide some context to what I really wanted to talk about. And that is the empire's new playbook. The patterns that I see emerging that are really indicative of where the repressive and oppressive tactics of the state are now in comparison to the past, and where they are likely headed given the way the state is ramping up the militarization and the advancement of authoritarian politics. And so in part 2, we're going to explore the empire's new playbook. If this content has resonated with you, then I encourage you to like this channel, subscribe to it. And I often hear people, share some similar ideas to me. So I'm not the only one talking about these things, but I do think that I often have some very unique perspectives on these types of things. And I'm looking forward to sharing them with you. And also, one of the reasons why I'm doing this again is to connect with more people. People who are on the ground, actually involved in organizing. Because my goal, me and my wife and my family, our goal is to move forward in a way where as much of our lives as possible is aligned with living for freedom, fighting for freedom, being proponents and pushers of the creation of a world where we are able to live a full human experience, where we are in control of our time and energy. And we get to decide where and with whom and how we expend that time and energy. So thank you for watching. Until next time, I'm just Mike, and this is Drawing the Line.